Sorry.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Real Woman, Real Purpose talk show, live in the On Purpose Woman Global Community Facebook group. I'm Ginny Robertson and one of the co-hosts of the Real Women, Real Purpose talk show. And I'm also the founder of the On Purpose Woman Global Community and the founder and publisher of On Purpose Woman magazine. I'm here with two of my favorite people, Maria Darby and Danita Terry, and we're going to be talking about her story, the journey of women through the ages. We're going to highlight why Women's Her Story Month is important and why women's stories are important. And we'll also talk about the work of the Maryland Women Heritage Center. So hi, Maria and Danita. I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Hi, Ginny. Thanks for having us today. We're very excited to be here.
You're welcome. And before we get started with all that, we want to talk about today, I want to share a little bit of info about the two of you. Danita Terry is a communications professional with years of experience. She is currently the vice president of the Maryland Women's Heritage Center's board of directors. And Maria Darby is a communications development and operations professional and currently the president of the Maryland Women's Heritage Center. And both ladies are passionate about women's issues and the opportunities women have to create systemic positive change in our world. So we're going to talk about the Maryland Women's Heritage Center in a little bit, but right now I'm kind of feeling the need to talk about how this feels like a full circle moment for me. Back when the Maryland Women's Heritage Center was creating the physical space to house the exhibits, I met Jill Moss Greenberg somewhere. I don't know where. She was one of the women who was helping to make these things happen. She was on the radio show, the Woman Talk Live radio show that I did with Ann Quasman, and I wrote an article about the Maryland Women's Heritage Center in On Purpose Woman magazine when it was a print publication. So how many years ago do you think that was?
Oh my goodness. It feels like forever ago, right?
At least 15 years, I'm going to say.
15 years. And so here we are, right? Here we are. It just felt like, oh, we've circled back around and we're still talking about this same thing, just in a way that we would have never dreamed we could have talked about it 15 years ago on our computers and seeing each other. That's really cool. So this is Women's Her Story Month. So let's start out by talking about why is it important that we have a month to acknowledge and celebrate women's stories?
You know, it's really interesting. It actually hasn't been around that long. I didn't really realize. It started in 1987, really initially coming out of California, celebrating a week of what's the best woman kind of idea. And I think it's so critical that even 30 years later, give or take, that we are really still focused on the contributions of women past and future and present, because so much of our past, there's so much history of women, and particularly women of color, haven't been recorded in any way that we see in history books. It's not the discussions at the dinner room table or in your history classes. And part of our real focus during this whole month, ours and many other organizations, is about raising up the stories of women to make sure that their stories are told and that we recognize on whose shoulders we stand, not only as women, but as a community and as a country.
Yeah. Danita, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's critical to sort of always know from where you come. Mm-hmm. And, I think the first place starts is the home, your family. When I consider the history of the women in my family, that hasn't even really been told fully. And then you think about globally, nationally, there are so many stories that haven't been told. There are so many inventions, acts of courage that women have been a part of. And if we want to affect change and empower girls on the go forward, we have to tell the stories. We have to share the stories, and they have to be incorporated in history.
Yes, that's a great point. And I don't know what they're teaching in history these days, but I know the only women I heard about in U.S. history classes were, the one who sewed the flag.
I was going to say Dolly Madison.
Which was a woman's thing to do. They couldn't have a man sewing the flag, right? Dolly Madison, who was the helpmate, if you will. Martha, we heard about the women who were kind of supporting the men. And they weren't even seen in that great of a light as probably the stuff they really were doing. They were just like I don't want to say arm candy, but kind of arm something. They were just there. I can't remember any women like much less any women of color, because there were just no people of color other than George Washington Carver in the history books, you know, that were mentioned in a way that said, oh, wow, she did that. You know, to me, it looked like they were always suffering or something.
I think part of it is that women, you know, I think we do the work, like we roll up our sleeves and get the work done. We do what's called upon that we need to do. And I think that's true. And when we've seen it during wars that our country has had, you know, in terms of women going into the factories and running those, and then sort of being told, well, now go back home when it's done. And I think that we're sometimes not great at telling our own stories because we don't always value it when the moment is happening, because we're very focused on the outcome. We want to make the community better. We're focused on our family surviving. We want, you know, we're supporting the mostly led male world at that time, certainly, and during the ages. And I think that therefore the stories get lost. You know, women don't have an opportunity to be, it wasn't been recorded on paper, but in other cultures, particularly in the Indian culture, for, you know, the indigenous people culture, a lot of women are highly valued in that culture, and how they talk about the stories are passed down through generations through the women. And so I think it's an interesting sort of tie that our history actually values the role in this country, the role of women, you know, becoming from the indigenous people, but we ourselves have sort of advanced to a place where we aren't really as advanced, which is kind of an interesting, you know, dichotomy of time.
Yeah.
I also think that women get caught up in the doing and not the telling. So many times when a woman is trying to make a change or make an impact, it's for the generations. It's for her children and her children's children and on and on. So sometimes the story gets lost in the doing, and that's why it's not always recorded. But then again, on that same note, traditionally women are the sages. They're the ones who are telling the stories. They're, you know, they're the little griots of the village or of the, you know, the family. Go listen, go sit over there by your great grandmother or your grandmother to hear this story, but it never gets documented.
Yeah. And it never, in my mind, it seems like it was never important enough to the people who had the power to document.
Right.
Because women also didn't really have the power to document. I mean, they could write it down, but where would it go?
That's true.
Right. You had a family Bible or something to be discovered decades later.
Exactly.
And I love what you said, Danita, and about, you know, we get caught up in the doing, women get caught up in the doing. And I think for a lot of women, especially women that we know about now in history, they didn't even know they were necessarily doing something remarkable. They were just doing what they do. Like you say, they had a focus. I'm doing this for my family. I'm doing this for my children. I'm doing this for the country. I'm, you know, but I'm nobody special, because even my generation of women, we weren't taught to talk all that great about ourselves and
Well,
to
I
think
don't
that
think
we
that-
were anything remarkable.
I think we don't always, because we didn't hold positions of power in the way that we thought of in this country, is that your voice is not important if you're not in the power position, whatever that is, whether it's in government or whether it's in, you know, companies or in organizations, and even in heads of families. If you think about it, in many families throughout time, women have had a key role, certainly in leading those, especially when men were out in the fields or, you know, and other kinds of work. And so that piece, though, isn't translated because we don't own our power. We aren't as comfortable talking about it. We're not as comfortable sort of talking about ourselves at all, or necessarily claiming our accomplishments. And I think that contributes to the fact that the oral story is okay, because you're just sort of sharing the tale, right? That sort of feels appropriate. You're sharing the tale of your grandparents, or, you know, your aunt or your uncle or your, you know, the family members, but you don't always tie that to being part of history, how the story becomes part of the record. And that's what we value, is the record. I know in our family, Danita said, you know, it's the women who know the stories. You know, if I need to say, who was the great aunt that came, you know, that used to live out there in Colorado? My father would never have been able to sort of pull those names out of his head, but my grandmother, she would be able to articulate, you know, age, rank, and file about everything and how they got there and what did they do, where did their children go. And in that was embodied the tale of why they ended up in Colorado, not here in Maryland, where in the Maryland, Pennsylvania area where we came from. So, you know, I think that that's a piece of what is recorded becomes what is valuable, and who is controlling what's recorded. And that, you know, is really kind of that place where you sort of, which came first, the chicken or the egg? how do you sort of make sure that that changes as we go forward?
And to your point of we're not comfortable with telling our story, I think almost as equally important, and probably what has prevented many stories of being told, is that the keepers of the power of the telling of the stories didn't deem them important either. So if they didn't deem it important and we didn't, weren't comfortable sharing, it doesn't get recorded. It doesn't get told, except for only your small circle.
Right. That's true.
So it's a mindset, that has to take place as well. When I was working on my in my master's program, I was doing a story on women's leadership. Oh my gosh, it was the most difficult thing to find. It was not documented, and unfortunately, I hadn't heard of Frances Hesselbein at that time. I probably could have learned a lot about women's leadership, but finding books that were talking about how women were leading, and I mean, this was 18 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And the progress that we have made in that time is astonishing. I mean, there's so much out there right now. That's so true. Many studies, so many books.
In the early books that were written about women and how we lead were not written by women, which, and I'm sure you found that when you were doing, your research, is that it's like, okay, so even when we determined that it was critical that we talk about this, and there is some variance in importance to the way that women lead and what might make that different and be then valuable to the conversation, we didn't record it ourselves, which tells you how short of a time it's been since women were in positions to take control of their narrative. And that's why months like Women's History Month, it's not that I think that Women's HERStory Month is the only month we should talk about women, but it gives us a focus, an opportunity to lift up stories in a very specific time frame where there's attention, right? Sort of national attention on the issue. And I think that is really helpful to us as a community as we continue to learn this, because as Danita said, 18 years ago, which is not, it's not that long ago. Women have only had the right to vote for, 100 years. So you think about how that all plays out. Our own generation and our parents and their parents' generation lived through this change that I think a lot of young people are not necessarily as familiar with, because that hasn't been the world that they've lived in.
Right.
Yeah. I remember, I was thinking that exact same thing, because about 15, maybe it's been a little more than 15 years ago, I remember when some of the first books on women's leadership started coming out, and you're right, they were written by men. And it was interesting because men were writing about it in a really good way. They were saying, this is what works when women lead. Mm-hmm. But I don't think there were enough women out there who thought anybody would take it seriously. Mm-hmm. If they wrote about how women lead, we had to get that stamp of approval from the guys first, which is kind of infuriating when you really think about it. And I just thought that was so interesting. And I remember thinking it was great, and also thinking, wow, they can't just let us have anything, can they? They got to just got to just grab onto that now and take credit for it. It's true. But, that's the beginning, at least, of about it.
Why we still need men to be men and to be supporters, right? Because even that much, certainly we've made great strides, but it hasn't changed so dramatically that we can do it alone. Which right. I think is an interesting piece that I think women do really well, is that we learn how to, which is kind of a double-edged sword. I think we learn how to do things in a way that makes people think they did it themselves, which is effective for the people and sort of how they feel about it. But that's how we often get our champions, right? Because we figure out what motivates them, often white males, to help them then be our advocate until we can gain enough ground to do it, never alone, but how can we be the central voice and not the periphery voice? And I think that's just an interesting piece as you sort of study the last 100 years. And certainly when women were fighting for the right to vote, you saw how that had to happen, or it would never have happened otherwise.
I think that's so true. And in my corporate career in finance, there were not a lot of women in executive positions, and there would be often I'd be the only woman in a meeting who had a position. And I learned early on that I had to temper myself. I had to, even when I said something and somebody else grabbed onto it and now it was their idea, I knew I had to play this game a bit and step back and then get them on my side, not humiliating them or calling them out on anything. And hopefully that's not a game that needs to be played so much anymore, but you learn pretty quick, because otherwise you get labeled some not very nice names.
And I think that's why
troublemaker
we're at
being the nice one.
consensus. I think that's why we are known for, and probably a little better than men at consensus leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because we've kind of been doing it forever.
Yeah. And, we tend to want to look at the big picture and how can we benefit the most people? It's really not about me getting my way, because that may not be the best thing to do, but yeah.
And sometimes getting your way doesn't actually change it might change it for you, which is great, right? That's important potentially for what it is, but it doesn't necessarily change the system. And in order to change the system, you have to figure out how to work across the aisles, whatever the aisle happens to be. And you're right, I think women have had to do that. So we're natural at doing it. And I think it's what we're seeing now in political offices, that regardless of what political party people are, that having women at the table helps create dialogue and opportunities for dialogue that didn't necessarily happen when everyone was the same, when it was all males leading. And I think that, that just recognizes that it's not that the way women lead is better or the way that men lead is better. It's that when we are in that shared role, we're far more effective. And it's just that women are still such a small minority of, and any role, whether it's government roles or the C-suite or, in the press, et cetera, in terms of, and so we're making progress, but there's still much to be done.
And the first person I thought about when you said that was Barbara Jordan. I mean, she wrote about how she would have to sit down with the good old boys from Texas to get things done. And she was very effective at it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because you can't change the system unless you can be part of the system. And you can't be part of the system if you're rocking the boat too much, or if they fear you and fear you getting some power. So she was very, very smart. She was very strategic in all of that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to say about Women's HERStory Month before you move on and talk about the Maryland Women's Heritage Center?
No, I just think it, like in all months, I think that, there's always detractors who think like, aren't we past that? And I think of each of the months that have different, whether we're highlighting whoever's stories or whatever cultures, it's just a way to sort of show the melting pot that we are, right? So if you just look at it from not your own personal, do I care or not care about these issues, but say, how are we celebrating the melting pot that is our country? The opportunity for focus in different months are important. And if we really, delve down, we know that there is still not equality among all of the races and creeds and sexes. And so until we get to that place, and I hope I live to see it, frankly, when we need no more months of any kind, because it's just how we live every day. But until then, I think it's critical that we highlight so that we can continue to educate. Danita and I were saying, and certainly this is true of you, Ginny, we feel like we know a lot about women's contributions and women's history, and we seek it out and we look for it in our communities and in our organizations and our lives. And every day I'm fascinated about how little I know, really. And that's because women have been making her story for, ever, but we've only been talking about it recently. So no matter how well read you are, or well informed or networked you are, there's whole pieces of the puzzle that, we only have a fraction of right now, any individual person. And so that's why I love it. Like, I make a particular focus to learn about women during Women's History Month or any other month around those cultures, because I'm reminded of how little you actually know. And until you test that and continue to educate yourself, you'll never actually evolve into a community where it's just a natural part of who we are until all the stories are at the table.
I agree. Years ago, I'm going to talk about a man for just a minute, but it illustrates the point you're making, Maria. Years ago, there was a Black journalist for the Baltimore Sun named Gregory Kane. Mm-hmm. And in one of his columns, he wrote about having attended a Black journalist convention or conference. Mm-hmm. And people were writing him, pushing back, why do you get a Black journalist? We don't get white people's, all that crap that we've heard over the years. And he said something that has stuck with me, and I know it had to be 20 plus, maybe more years ago. He said, when the time comes that you stop referring to me as a Black journalist, there will be no more need for Black journalist conferences. And I thought, there it is right there. Mm-hmm. It's what you're saying. When you stop referring to me as a female, whatever, mm-hmm. And I feel like it's out there on the table for everybody to see the accomplishments of women, then we may not need that month anymore, or we'll need it for a different reason. Right. We'll do it more as a celebration, and maybe we'll have maybe we'll have a celebration for men one month and their accomplishments. I mean, wouldn't that be kind of cool, Maybe, maybe in my next lifetime or something. I don't know.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Danita, did you want to add anything to that before we move on?
Well, just in terms of the importance of the month, right now, while we're all on Zoom, so many people are having Zoom family meetings, take one of the meetings in March to talk about the women in your family. You might be surprised by what you learn or what you do now that someone was doing, years ago. My grandmother and I worked for the same organization. How weird is that?
Oh, that's funny.
And just to see, what how your path tracks to someone else's path, where your strengths are, and all of that, all of those little things that you can discover when you start talking about the women in your family.
Yeah, such a great point. Thank you for that. So I can't think of any greater example of an organization that has taken on the responsibility for, I guess I'll call excavating as well as preserving women's stories in the Maryland Women's Heritage Center. And for those tuning in who don't know about this center, it was established to preserve the past, understand the present, and shape the future by recognizing, respecting, and sharing the experiences and contributions of Maryland women of diverse backgrounds and from all regions of the state. It grew out of the Maryland Women's History, I left a word out there, project that began in 1980, which was a collaboration between the Maryland Commission for Women and the Maryland Department of Education. It is the first of its kind in the nation and is a unique kind of museum, if you will. It's really a place for collecting women's stories, past, present, and future. And as I mentioned, Maria is the president of the board of directors and Danita is the vice president. So I shared a bit of the bio of the center, but what's at the heart of it? I mean, those are the facts. What's the essence of the center and the real purpose for it being here?
Do you want to start, Danita? You tell. You were there. You were involved first before me, so go ahead.
Oh wow, I didn't know that. Okay.
Well, when I met Jill and oh my goodness, I can't think of her last name right now. Oh, Linda Shevitz at my place of work, and they were sharing about the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, and I was fascinated because there needs to be an organization that is doing just what we do: excavating, celebrating, and publicizing what women in this state have done. And at the heart of it, that's what we do. We celebrate it. We partner with other organizations who are doing, have the same interest, and we're uplifting the accomplishments of women. And there are many ways that we do it. We work with the, I'm going to mess this up. The Maryland Commission for Women and the Maryland's Women Hall of Fame to lift up women who are doing extraordinary things in the state. And that's our dedication, and that's our role. But I'll let Maria continue.
I think that the reason I wanted Danita to sort of start was because of her sort of early connection through professionally. It really introduced me to the center and to Jill Moss Greenberg that you talked about earlier, who's still involved, who's still an emeritus member of our board, who's still doing the work. And I think that what she and Linda Shevitz realized is that there was, because they were from, Linda was in the Department of Education, that there was so little that was recorded, and that it was when you ask people who are, famous women, you heard the same 3, 5, whatever, 7 people, and that the story is greater than that. And we focused in Maryland because, well, that's where we are, but it also was that Maryland has an interesting history, and I won't even go into all that, but we know that we kind of where we sit in the middle of, sort of northern, sort of southern, depending on who you are, where you feel, and what moment what side you want to sit on at any moment. But it really is an interesting community from our roots in terms of the diversity that exists in our state among people in all ways. And then the role that Maryland had in the suffragist movement over time and women's rights issues. And so it allowed us to really create a place and a space for those discussions that weren't happening any other place. You know, they might be happening in certain political affiliation parties discussions, and it might have been happening in certain schools or in certain kinds of women's groups, but it wasn't coming from a place of what are all the women doing? So women in the arts, women in STEM, women in politics, unsung hero women in your communities. And it was really about focusing on that any woman can be a hero, a shiro, as we call them, because we're the torchbearers for the history, for the culture, and have had so many roles that created the foundation for society in a lot of ways. And certainly as the bearers of children, we create that opportunity, you know, in terms of being able to often be the first educators of our children as well, in terms of how do we continue to build upon those stories and recognize its value. And if you've ever dealt with, Jill and Linda, there's really no more powerful voice for not hearing no, as in their ears. I don't think their ears even register that word. It's like, yes we can, we'll figure it out. How do we work the system to make sure that we have created a space and place that's safe? Early on, it was necessary for it to be a safe place for women even to have these kinds of discussions, because women certainly didn't come from the same kind of background. Not everyone in every generation and every kind of community are comfortable learning from each other because they don't really know the appropriate words to use. And that's what the center fostered, is that opportunity to have a safety net for maybe candid conversations about what it's like to be a woman in the state of Maryland over time. Mm-hmm. And how do we tell those stories effectively and make sure they aren't lost as the world advances?
Wow. Yes. That must have been, I can't imagine taking that on 40 years ago. I mean, there probably were a lot of no's given, or at least this is impossible. Oh, he can never do that. Nobody's ever done that before, all those standard kind of things, but they just kept plugging away. And I remember thinking by the time I heard about it, they were starting to looking for a place to actually house everything. Mm-hmm. It just sounded like it was, they did that next right thing, put their one foot in front of the other and just kept moving forward. Mm-hmm. And I did see Jill at that event you had, was it 2 years ago now, mm-hmm. to kick off something with the Maryland Women's Heritage Center. And she was still just as sharp and just as in it as she was before. And she had all these ideas for me, and she's making notes on a card for me, and all of that. And I kind of meant to stay in touch. This is a good reminder to reach out to her and just say hello again. So you mentioned unsung sheroes. Can either of you think of an unsung shero that you heard about through this process? I know I didn't ask you to think about this ahead of time, that might really surprise us, like somebody who did something pretty remarkable in your mind.
One of the things that I really enjoy about this, so it's not really a specific person, but I'll still think about that. But when we're in the physical space of the center, we have a lot of young people, so children that come through the center and other visitors as well. And so there's a place for them to write in their own shero, whomever they want, whatever parameters they define. And I am always really, and I don't know, I love the fact that so many people write about, teachers that made the difference, to give them the strength to go forward, to pursue an avenue they might have been nervous about, or a neighbor who stepped in because mom had to go back to work and enter the workplace and didn't have some after school support in the same way as they're available today. I think all of those really remarkable stories remind me that there's probably so much more to those people than we know, right? You're seeing this one young person sort of moment of time of how they engaged. But I bet if we looked up their names and traced that back, how many other stories there are. And that's in 50 years, 100 years, some of those women will be the women that are now being talked about, right? For the things that they did, the differences that they made. And our ability to have a place where people can record that is kind of incredible. And I, as much as I love reading about all the amazing, famous women, that we've unearthed and sort of share their stories, and trying to make them famous because we want to make sure their stories are told. It's all the regular people, the regular women that are carrying the torch for the stories that will take us forward as a community. And it was really life-changing for me to read some of those in a lot of ways.
Yeah. What about you, Danita?
Well, it's funny you should ask. A few weeks ago, I just had an event called A Salute to Maryland's Women, Black Women Legislators. And I was really blown away by how ordinary these women were until they weren't. So I learned about Victorine Q. Adams, who was the first Black woman to sit on the Baltimore City Council. Berta Freedom Welcome, who was the first Black woman in the state to be a state senator. And then that led me to find out something about another woman who's not from Maryland, but that the first Black woman to be a senator was actually from Michigan. And the person who was working with me on the program was Dorothy Bailey. She's a Maryland Women Hall of Fame inductee, and she's just a wealth of information and connections and knowledge. And they're just ordinary people, but they did extraordinary things. And, you really only have to do one extraordinary thing to change the trajectory of your life or others' lives. But, Victorine Q. Adams was just, she was a homemaker. Well, she was a teacher, she had a family, but she wanted to change some things in her neighborhood. And she saw that as a way to do it. She also started several organizations, in the city of Baltimore. So for me, that's still on my mind. These women who had jobs, had children to raise, husbands to feed and take care of, and they just said, "But I want to do this to help my community."
Yeah, I love what you said, that they were ordinary women until they weren't. That is such a powerful statement, isn't it? Such a small statement and such a powerful one. And I think there's a lot of women, and some of them will be watching this now or later, who hear the word extraordinary and they have this other idea of what that means. And it's like, oh, I've got to go be one of those people. But some of these women, they made extraordinary differences in their home, with their family, in their small community. And it made that, and then who knows what the ripple effect from that was. So these aren't necessarily women who ran for president. These were women who, but they paved the way possibly for somebody else to get that good idea as well.
And to feel
exactly
it,
holding meetings in their dining rooms, in their living rooms of people in the community who wanted to also uplift either an idea or another person.
People have to see and unfeel, and women in particular have to feel confident to be able to lead when there's not that much history in front of us that show that. And so that starts by the individual. So whether it's the mother, the teacher, the aunt, the neighbor, who makes those differences, that create the environment for future extraordinary work. It's incredible. And this morning, they just released the Maryland Commission for Women announced the Women's Hall of Fame for this year. And so, and I'm always amazed and always interested about how many women they get submitted, and then, sort of narrowing it down. And, Liz Bobo is one of the honorees, and Margaret Briggs Gregory Hawkins, involved in the suffragist movement, Ruby Reese Moon, Nancy Welker of Prince George's County, who's a physicist, and an activist, which is very interesting to me. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Yes, Ruby is the activist, and Nancy Walker is a physicist, and then Celeste Winans. And I just think that's, those are amazing women that I'll now learn more about. Like, I know I've met Liz Bobo, but the others I have not. I don't know is Margaret Briggs Gregory Hawkins. We have a marker in the city that we did with the Women's Heritage Center. But lots of the other people I don't necessarily know about. So it encourages us then to learn more. And then they also have a young women's leaders that they announced, and which is always, I think, of sort of the next generation. Danita and I have attended this event in person a number of years, and then they read these amazing stories of all these young women. And I have never felt like more of a slacker. I read what they've done at 18, and
these are really young women then.
Right, 18, 19, 20. And I'm like, and they've done, and they're, incredible scholars and are doing amazingly well in school. And I just think, the future is bright, right? The future is bright, and being able to, hold up young women, I think is so critical, so that the even younger women, the 10-year-olds, the 14-year-olds, the 16-year-olds see how they can make a difference. Because, the earlier you start, the earlier that you claim your story, are comfortable with telling about the successes that you had and how you've engaged the community, the more likely you are to do it yourself, because the path is being laid. And I think that that's incredible. And it's been such an exciting time to read. And all of those women that have been entered into the Women's Hall of Fame are on the Maryland Women's Heritage website too. So you can read about them. And I know I go back and scan them and I'm like, oh my God, I forgot, I didn't know more. And it encourages you to push forward and learn more, which I think is exciting.
I remember the first Maryland Hall of Fame ceremony I went to. And well, I was surprised. I didn't really know who was being honored at the, when I went. And I was really excited. One of the founders of my sorority was being inducted into the Hall of Fame.
Wow.
And also, this is the one that really blew me away. A scientist, or she was either a scientist or a physicist. I'm sorry, I'm not really a science person, who was at the University of Maryland. She was a Nobel Prize winner for a collaboration she had with another woman on finding like a little gene that was in the link to go towards helping to cure cancer. And I was like, oh my God, a Nobel Prize winner. She's right there with me.
Wow.
It is amazing. Both of the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines that we all are way too familiar with now in the world of COVID certainly had women in lead roles on those development teams. And, I remember reading the stories about, when the companies that were producing them, and of course they should get credit for doing all of that work. And then sort of buried in the lead was the role of these women that were part of the team. And that to me said, oh my, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, we're looking back on this pandemic and saying, what was the craziness? Those two women and the other women on that team will be the women that, that are kind of like the women we're talking about today that have been inducted into the Hall of Fame. They will have their own place in history, not for a great reason, frankly, in terms of the need for it, but it's those kind of women that are doing the work, that are just doing their jobs, right? They're doing their jobs because that's what they're skilled in. And they stepped up to the plate to lead during a time of crisis. And that's, we all do that in different ways. The crisis might be bigger or smaller, or the moment that you're stepping up to the plate might be, remarkable or not so remarkable, but it's all part of the fabric that we're weaving in our communities, in our countries, and in the stories that will be told for generations to come.
I hadn't planned on mentioning her today, but I think my former mother-in-law should probably be in that Maryland Hall of Fame, or at least mentioned in the center, and I'll tell you why. She was the mother of my first husband, and she went to medical school in 1957. She was the first woman to be admitted into the University of Maryland School of Medicine. Hopkins turned her down because she was a woman. They actually told her that. Plus, she had 3 small children. So she was not, she was not right out of college. She'd been some years. They'd moved from the city way out into the country, and she needed to do something. And she was like, I've always thought about being a doctor, and did all the stuff she had to do. Not only did Hopkins tell her no, she had some incredible, which I won't go into here, connections through the university and the hospital, through family members, and they still just went, no. Another woman was admitted the same year, and they graduated together. And if I'm not mistaken, she was magna cum, and the other one was which is the highest one, magna and summa. Yeah. And so the top 2. And so there's been a lot of stories written about them in the Sun paper and everything. So that's, I'll have to see how I might get her on somebody's radar, Maria.
Absolutely. I think that's, it's these kind of stories, the conversations we're having now, generate exactly that, what you just did. I have a very good friend, Carol Goodman, who went to business school not that many years ago. I mean, she's in my generation. And she was one of like 8 women in her class. And so, she doesn't really talk about that. And I saw a picture when she went back for her reunion, and we got us to talking about that story and what it was like to be a woman, getting your MBA at a, top flight university in this country, where you would have thought women were admitted long before her and long before her that generation that we're in. And it's not that long ago. And so
Right.
the path forward seems long because the path behind us is not so long. And we have to continue to move on the path, because as we've seen, over time, that it's easily eroded if you don't continue to fortify it by more stories, by more contributions, by more acknowledgement. Because if you take your eye off the ball, the backward slide can be very quick. And just the pandemic is said. I read an article that said it will take 10 years from now, a decade, for women to recover from this experience of the pandemic and what it has done for them in terms of, their professional and community interests, in terms of how they're pursuing those and what roles that they've had to step back from, which, it's amazing to think a year in time can change, the trajectory of people's lives for more than a decade going forward.
Yeah, I read that same article and it was really distressing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. I also just want to throw out there that she died 3 or 4 years ago. I don't remember exactly. And I got a call from Jacques Kelly, this Baltimore Sun, Jacques Kelly, and he was writing her obituary. And he said, I somehow I found you and I connected. Would you like to say a few words about her? And I did. But I just thought I was really pleased that somebody was giving her that attention. I think he'd written a story years ago. So he was like, kind of wrapping up the loose end now that she had passed on. So yeah, we need more of that. And we need more women out there in positions that want to tell other women's stories as well.
That's true.
I think, yeah. So let's talk about the center a little bit more. It isn't a physical center.
It is now. We do. We're very excited.
I didn't even think that was on the radar yet.
Well, we had a physical space, and then the world changed a little bit, and we had to find alternative. And it's really how we've grown up. So a good thing came out of that. We really have increased our virtual presence and the information that you can find on the website, which will be helpful to people and helps us all sort of expand our knowledge base. But just this, right before the holidays, right before Christmas, we were so excited to enter into a partnership with Marian House, and another incredible nonprofit in Baltimore serving women. And we're a tenant in the space that they're doing in the very locally famous Women's Industrial Exchange building. And we had hoped to be sort of actually open already, but COVID has sort of slowed down this whole process.
Yeah.
We're doing a little renovation and things to sort of change it into what will work for us. But we are hopeful that early this summer that we'll be back physically in a space as well as virtually. So we're so excited about this partnership. We've done work with Marian House for years because of the similarity in our kind of focus. But this is a moment that shows you when good karma goes out, good karma comes back. And how do we support each other? They were in a position to have a space, and that they're using the top half of the building and didn't need immediately the bottom half. And they were looking for someone with a, kind of symbiotic mission in terms of focus. And so they chose us, and we said, yes, we're excited to do it. And it's been a process. So yeah, soon, keep your fingers crossed, soon, very soon.
I saw that on the website, but it didn't make any sense to me. I thought, what does Marian House have to do with that? And what does that have to do with I didn't know. So there is no more women's exchange the way it was then.
That's correct.
Yeah. But what a great location.
It is great.
I mean, how many people walk by that place every day? So that's really exciting. Invite me to the grand opening, please.
And it's great to be in a place that has the history of women embodied in it.
Exactly.
Like there's
exactly.
The industrial, that's a whole nother story, but the industrial exchange itself is such an interesting story that frankly, I've learned way more about as we've sort of, engaged in this partnership than I did before, which I thought I knew a lot then. And amazing how you always learn more. And so that's a really cool space to be in. So we're excited.
So Maria, tell everybody the website address.
So it's MarylandWomen'sHeritageCenter.org. And we also have the same as that's the same for our Facebook page. It has all of the links to exhibits, links to the Women's Hall of Fame, It tells you about the STEM exhibits that we have, which we didn't get to talk about. So incredible, highlighting the women in science. We have an arts exhibit that we highlight how women have contributed to the arts. And of course, we have a suffragist exhibit that we are taking around the state, particularly in this year. But all of the information is online because we know that that's great for us, not just during COVID, but for us to really have a presence for women's stories to be told, worldwide, is to have a place where people can access it easily. So check it out. There's great information about events and activities that are coming up, celebrating as we end March, but also going into the spring and summer as we partner with other organizations as well to deliver programs focused on women.
It's an amazing website. I mean, I was on there for an hour today, just kind of going, oh, I didn't know that. Oh, I've never heard that person before. So, and a great resource for people who have children at home. They need to educate and give some new exposure to things too. So before we wrap up, I know that you both do a lot of volunteering and a lot of philanthropic work in your communities, and you could be doing that work with anyone out there. So I want to hear from each of you. I know we opened up and I said why, but I want you to go really deep and say, like, what would your dream be for the center? And why did you choose this organization over, not that you chose it over others, you're probably all still involved in like how many other organizations, but what is it that keeps you coming back? I mean, you've got a lot of longevity with this organization. So Danita, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm pretty committed in life in general to making people aware of things that should be obvious, but they aren't. And I'm really jazzed by the fact that there is an organization in Maryland that is willing to uncover stories and tell them. And, I love to write. I've been doing that for most of my life. So I like telling stories. I like reading stories. I like learning about stories. And that is a lot of what Maryland Women Heritage Center does. So, it's for me, it's a personal draw. I like uplifting women. I like telling stories. I like connecting dots. Oh, that person did this then, and now we're doing this, and then we can make that. I love it. And it's also an opportunity for me to personally do things that I like put together programs and have them that educate other people. So that's the why. And I really have developed really great relationships with the other women on the board. They're interesting, they're talented, they know information, and it's really been a really good experience for me.
Yeah.
And the fact that I come from a family of educators too, there's that education piece. I'm being educated, I'm helping other people learn.
Thank you. And you bring up something that has been a personal philosophy of mine for many years. I don't buy into this idea of like selfless philanthropy. There's a need and you go fill it. I think there's a need and we fill it when it calls to us and where we can use our natural gifts and talents in service, that we don't have to twist ourselves into, I use the example sometimes, and I won't go into the story, when I volunteered to be a Cub Scout leader when my son was 7. And it was the worst decision I could have made in many years. And I wasn't the right person for it, but nobody else wanted to do it. And
Right.
My gifts and talents were not going to show up there. So I think I'm glad that you said that. You're getting a ton out of it for yourself. And we should always get a ton out of what we do when we're giving of ourselves like that. I believe we should be just selfish as all get out and get as much as we want back. What about you, Maria?
So I think that I've been so blessed to, I went to a high school that was, all girls high school. I've been exposed to a lot of amazing women leaders that have mentored me and have supported my own professional and personal journey. I've been in the junior league. Involved with the center. I work with Girl Scouts. I have seen the power that women have, but I also know that a lot of times the women that we see and read about that are awarded, all kinds of wonderful awards for which they are deserving, though, is a small piece of the whole pie. And I believe that it is my responsibility to give back, to kind of pay back the experiences and sort of play that forward as my own career and my own opportunities have evolved. And when I met the women of the Women's Heritage Center, I thought to myself, how can I not know these names? I've been, pretty, I would say, networked in the sort of women's community, the women's philanthropic community, as part of my career and my own sort of nonprofit volunteer work for a long time. And yet these women who had made it happen in Maryland, they're the names who are that are, rolling up their sleeves and getting it done. Linda Mahoney, has just recently passed, and Linda Shevitz, as we talked about, and Jill Moss Greenberg, and Diana Bailey, who's currently our executive director. These women have been doing the hard, incredible work with other women for decades, and they weren't household names in the way that I feel like, in the sense of being of the value they were bringing. And then it just made me expand my mind to say, why not? And I think it's because, again, we're in the doing, right? It's work that needs to be done, and these women are getting it done. And there's not been a focus on them. And I thought it was really selfish, frankly, when I joined initially, because I was like, I want to know these women. I feel like they have a story that I need to know, because it just sort of emboldens me to fight forward, right? And I just will never forget some of my early meetings when they're talking about these things. Like, it was like, I feel like when you read about women sitting around a kitchen table, decades and decades ago, and then all these amazing movements came from them, seems like, oh, well, that was kind of an interesting thing back then. But sitting around the table with these ladies, I'm like, this is happening right now. Like, I'm in this moment where women are creating incredible change and empowering other women to run for office, lead organizations, share their stories that once, not that long ago, wouldn't have happened. And it was a gift to be in the room of these people. It was like being in the presence of history in and of itself. And I just like, well, if I can be part of this, it will feed my soul in a way that I can hopefully do for someone else as I go forward, and that I'll make a difference. And I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to make a difference for women. I wanted to make a difference for young girls. I wanted to make sure that the stories continued to be told. And getting to be be involved in the organization, and then joining the board and being the president, has been really one of the greatest gifts of my life. It's been incredible.
Wow. Well, that was beautifully said by both of you, and you've just both made me right about why I think we should give ourselves, out there, because we get tons from it. I mean, I could just feel both of your excitement and your reverence for it as well. So thank you both for being here and sharing your personal stories around this, the good work that you're doing with the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, and just the women's HERStory kind of movement, if you will, in general, because, we're just getting started with this, aren't we?
Yes.
And we got a long way to go, in a really good kind of way. We have a long way to go. So thank you all for being here again.
Thanks.
And I want to thank go ahead. You can thank me now. Yeah.
Thank you for having us.
You're so welcome. You're so welcome. We don't stand on formality here. And I want to thank all of you for joining us for the Real Women, Real Purpose talk show, live in the On Purpose Woman Global Community Facebook group. For a list of the Real Women, Real Purpose talk show topics, you can go to onpurposewomanmagazine.com and check out the current issue. Actually, while I have you here, you can also go to opwgc.com. That is my brand new website where everything is there. Stands for On Purpose Woman Global Community. You can reach the magazine, you can reach all about the community there as well. So check that out when you have a minute. If you love this interview and you want to share it with your friends, you'll find it on our YouTube channel within the next 48 hours or so. So go over to On Purpose Woman Global Community on YouTube and subscribe and sign up for notifications. There are already more than probably 35 to 40 inspiring, informative, and fun shows for you to watch on your YouTube channel. On Tuesday, March 30th, I'll be talking with, and I should have asked you how to say her name ahead of time, Maria, because you work with her, Sarah Kaltwasser.
That's correct.
Is that correct? Mm-hmm. We're going to be talking about art as self-care. So I'm really excited to have that conversation with Sarah. So thank you again for watching the Real Women, Real Purpose talk show. I'm Ginny Robertson, and I'll catch you again. Thank you.
Thanks, Ginny.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye,
you,
y'all.
Jenny.
Bye.